Well, House Speaker-designate John Boehner and other Republicans signaling that they may be more willing to compromise going forward. So will Tuesday's meeting at the White House be the first example of that, or will progressive Democrats make compromise impossible? Joining us now, Fox News contributor Doug Schoen. Doug Schoen is a former Bill Clinton pollster and Republican consultant Tony Saig. Good to see you both. In the spirit of Thanksgiving and bipartisanship, we asked you to join us here in the studio.
Pleased
to sit next to one another. Please behave.
Always a pleasure.
We'll try.
All right, gentlemen.
Tony,
so this little powwow at the White House on Tuesday. We know what the Republicans want when it comes to the Bush tax cuts. What would they be willing to settle for?
Well, the emerging consensus, Rick, is something that I think you've heard from not only Republicans but a lot of centrist Democrats. We would take a temporary extension. Republicans clearly want this to be a permanent thing. We did it in 2001 and 2003. It was sunsetted for 10 years. So now it's emerging as an issue again. We'd like to see that these tax rates, these top marginal tax rates, stay permanently at 37%. But we're willing to compromise because we do understand that in this deep economic recession, we can't play politics with such an important issue like the tax code.
Doug, the president's hearing it from liberals, from his left flank. Don't cave. Don't just give in and lie down to the Republicans. What's he going to do? It's kind of a tough spot.
You heard what he had to say just now. He clearly wants to compromise. The smartest thing to do is to tie a compromise along the lines that Tony described with a temporary extension of the unemployment benefits, which are now 99 weeks, which is quite generous, but we should get people through the holidays. We shouldn't cut them off before the holidays. If there could be some sort of grand compromise along those lines, it would be a very huge step in the right direction.
I don't understand, though. Why extending them for a period of time? I mean, obviously, they were meant to be temporary. That's why they're about to expire. But isn't it just sort of kicking it down the road a little bit? Why don't the Republicans rather stand firm and say, let's make these permanent?
Well, look, they were temporary, Rick, because they were passed in 2001 and 2003 in reconciliation. And that, as a mechanism, made a provision that said in 10 years we have to revisit this issue. We need to guarantee that there's at least a stability in our economy right now when we're the most vulnerable. But to Doug's point, look, the Republicans have shown compromise already on unemployment benefits. We said, let's pay for them with the unused money from stimulus, okay? That's one very concrete example of how we can get unemployment benefits extended, but at the same time make sure that the biggest job creators, the biggest investors in the private markets, and the biggest consumers of our goods don't get the biggest tax increase in American history just because Nancy Pelosi wants to have this disproportionate control over the agenda. Doug, it failed for 2 years. It's going to fail for another 2 if they follow her.
I mentioned this is a tough spot for the president because, you know, he's not going to win over Republicans and suddenly get a bunch of Republican votes by extending these tax cuts. And he is at risk of really sort of alienating or upsetting his base. And we know what happens when you upset your base. They don't come out and vote. That's what we just saw with the midterms.
Well, and that's the problem, because Nancy Pelosi's feeling is she delivered for the president on things like health care and the stimulus. He didn't have a narrative in the campaign that supported what she did. So she and the progressives, I think quite justifiably, feel abandoned. At the same time, the American people want the tax cuts extended, and there's a consensus in America to limit the size of government, limit spending during a crippling recession.
Tony, this negotiation, or a lack of negotiation, if that's what ends up happening, how does that sort of set the stage and give us all an idea about what the next 2 years might look like?
Well, this is actually exactly right, Rick. This is the most pivotal moment of this Obama presidency. This is Scene 1, Act 2 for President Obama, right? This is Pelosi's last stand. He can't give in to her. She is the only person who clearly did not receive the memo in Washington that temporarily extending the Bush tax cuts is what the emerging consensus seems to be. So I think if he gives in to Nancy Pelosi, he's going to reveal himself to be much more ideological than pragmatic, which is not what I think he needs to be for the next 2 years.
One of the people who will be taking part in this meeting is Mitch McConnell, who is the Senate Minority Leader. He has already stated that his #1 priority is to keep President Obama from winning a second term. Just from a practical standpoint, how do these two guys sit down, trust each other enough to have a conversation, to have a negotiation, when clearly, I mean, you know, he's already come out and said what his agenda is?
Politics is the art of the possible and the practical. Mitch McConnell is a pragmatist. What he said was not helpful. What Nancy Pelosi has said has not been constructive. We've got to get both sides together because Tony is right. We will set the tone for the next 2 years with what happens here, the president can begin to pivot to the center, as Bill Clinton did in '94 after the drubbing he took in the midterm elections, set the tone for the next 2 years and his reelection. If he gets this done, he's on the way to potentially resuscitating his presidency. If he doesn't, we could have hand-to-hand combat, enemies fighting enemies, and political gridlock in Washington, all to the bad.
We had the Fox Medical A-team on standby in case anybody needed stitches. Yeah. Thankfully, that wasn't necessary. Doug Schoen, Tony Sayegh, gentlemen,
Pleasure,
enjoy
Rick.
the rest of the holiday
We will.
weekend. Thanks for
so
coming.
much.
Thank you.